Hello again, everyone. Welcome back to the Aldersgate Experience, the podcast of Aldersgate Church in York, Pennsylvania. I'm Bob Kaylor.
And I'm Jeff Markey.
And producer Randy is at the board, making sure that everything is running smooth with audio and video.
Thank you, sir.
We're glad you've joined us for this edition. We're in the midst of this series on the seven churches of Revelation.
Yeah. And this week we were tackling Pergamum. And, you opened and closed with swords, and that was really fascinating. One was a humorous story. Another one was kind of a warning in some ways. But, you talked a lot about your time as working for the Gettysburg. What is it?
For the Park Service.
Yeah.
The first year I worked there, 1985, I was an intern. And then the second year I was a historical interpreter. So I did first-person interpretation on the battlefield, where I would go out in Civil War cavalry uniform. And I was portraying two different soldiers, one in the cemetery who had a friend who died and was buried in the cemetery. And so I'd talk about that person. And then the other would have been a member of the 2nd Pennsylvania Cavalry who was in the Provost Guard at Meade's headquarters and would have been behind the line at Pickett's charge, but wouldn't have been able to observe what was going on.
Is that the Clint Eastwood?
Yeah, that wearing the spurs, all of that was part of the deal. And it was really intense because I had to really research these characters because I was portraying real people.
Right.
And the other part of it was that when we would do these tours, people would come and then I'd give an introduction and I'd say, okay, from the time we get to this point, I'm going to be in first person. And then when we got to the end of the tour, I would step out of first person and say, okay, now you can ask me questions in modern. But people would ask questions along the way, like, what's that? They pointed a bus, like, what's that? Well, those wagons are getting big. Or, there's a helicopter. Man, the birds are strange in this place.
You had to get pretty creative.
Yeah, you had to get really creative because people would try to always play Stump the Guide. But the part for me that was most interesting was carrying all that weaponry as a cavalryman. You realize you'd have to be on horseback to carry all that.
Yeah.
Because you have the carbine, which weighs, 10 pounds or whatever, maybe 15.
Yeah.
No, not 15. That's a regular Civil War rifle weighs about 15 pounds. So let's say a carbine weighs 8 pounds. You had the big Colt 45 capped revolver.
Yeah.
Sort of the classic Clint Eastwood.
Right.
From Pale Rider. That's the Colt 45, kind of. And then the 1860 cavalry saber, which is a big saber, curved because the idea was it was a slashing weapon more than a stabbing weapon, designed for close combat. And so I always think about swords because we're not used to that. They're very ceremonial in our time in the military.
Right.
I mean, we celebrated our wedding anniversary this past weekend. And
congratulations.
Yeah, 38 years.
Wow.
We had a military wedding, though. We had a saber arch, so we had guys with the sabers kind of holding up there.
So cool.
And one of the Army traditions with that is that when the bride is coming down the aisle, after they pass the last set of swords, the man on the bride's side takes his saber and he whacks her on the behind with the flat of the saber.
Oh, wow.
And says, "Welcome to the Army." So it's kind of the tradition there with doing that. So sabers have a long history in military culture from the very beginning. And in this particular text, it's interesting to see Jesus wielding a sword.
Right.
Where we're not used to that.
Right. We're thinking gentle Jesus, meek and mild, right?
But he's wielding a sword, and it's a sword coming from his mouth, which suggests that it's his word that's really the cutting edge of what he's dealing with the church here in Pergamum.
Yeah, it reminds me of James and the warning that if you can control your tongue, you can control any other part of your body. Kind of reminds me of that. But of course, this is in context of Christ speaking to us, and this is really separating bone and marrow here.
Yeah, it really goes to that Hebrews, and that's a consistent theme. Hebrews 4:12, the word of God is living and active, sharper than any two-edged sword. Same word used for that Ramphia. And it's interesting, we talked about the Ramphia, which is if you haven't listened to the sermon yet, it's a long Thracian sword. curved sword, like almost like a cavalry saber, but this one was designed to be used with two hands. So it's an interesting word choice because most Roman soldiers would have carried what's called the gladius, or a shorter sword, but that sword was designed more for stabbing. So if you're at close range, pardon me for getting into all this technical military stuff with swords,
but it's fascinating.
But,
I mean,
but
in my opinion,
the gladius is designed for short thrusts to make, to stab the opponent, whereas the rhomphaia is a slashing weapon. It's designed to cut through things. It's designed to separate.
And it's still short range, but it's a much longer
you get a
sword.
longer reach with it. And so this idea of the rhomphaia coming out of Jesus' mouth, it's going to cut, and it's going to cut both ways. So in this particular text with this particular church, he's dealing not only with the church itself, but also with the opponents of that church, how he's going to bring judgment and rightly divide everything. So that's a big part of this particular text, that Jesus is weighing into this situation and separating truth from falsehood, what's right from what's wrong, who's on the right path and who's not.
Right. And he talks about this is what I hold against you, these words, and he defines very specifically what they are. The idolatry is part of it, bringing the teaching of Balaam, but also the way in which they're operating, taking some of the ideas from the Nicolaitans, which you talked about last week in Smyrna, didn't we?
Yeah. So the two things that are always kind of conflated in these texts are food sacrifice to idols and sexual immorality. And I explained that these rituals in these guilds and other places involved sacrificing food to idols, meaning that there was some kind of feast, and at those feasts, it was kind of a bacchanal where you had entertainment that was often of a sexual nature. So food and sex tend to go together.
Wow.
Interestingly, they're both things that we desire. They're both things that in and of themselves are neutral. God created both for us.
Yeah, absolutely.
And yet, in this particular case, these goods are elevated to ultimates. So particularly with sex, it's elevated to an ultimate rather than simply a good that's part of human life. It gets elevated to a thing that is human life. Idolatry gets elevated to a thing that is human life. We become the idols. Yeah. Now, in the Roman world, people were sacrificing to these idols. They're a very collectivist kind of culture. But the idea was we all have to be on the same page with worshiping these gods, or bad things are going to happen to us.
Right.
And now it's shifted, post-Enlightenment, fast forward from Rome, 1700 years.
Yeah.
You have the Enlightenment, and now we're sort of setting the idea of the divine aside, and we're saying now the individual is, in a sense, his or her own God.
Yeah.
And that's really an outgrowth of this. That's why I think this text is so relevant to us today, because the situations are slightly different, but what's happening here in our own time is very much a reflection of what the church is being tempted with in the time of Revelation.
Absolutely. These ideas are not new.
No.
You talked about Nietzsche, you talked about Freud. These are psychologists and people who are, working on psychology generally in modern times, but really these ideas are not really changed much from what we're looking at in these churches of Revelation.
Yeah, I think the post-Enlightenment world, again, trying to pull back from divinity to say we're going to be more humanistic. We've come out of what's called the Dark Ages or the Middle Ages, where there was religion and superstition. Now we've become more enlightened, and you've got philosophers, Immanuel Kant, and a whole host of philosophers who are, at best, deists. They sort of believe in a God, but one who's detached, or at worst, they're really sort of anti-God, atheistic, who are bringing forth these philosophies that say, look, pure reason is really what we're after. If we could just get to pure reason, and we could be gods ourselves. We can push religion aside because we don't really need that. It's all just about pure reason. And so there's really no moral absolute other than that which we create. And then you had, Nietzsche's kind of a nihilist, and God is dead, all of that. You have Marx with the whole Communist Manifesto and socialism trying to level everything out. putting a whole lot of faith in human systems.
Absolutely.
That when you cast aside original sin, when you take that out of the equation, bad things are going to happen.
Well, I mean,
because you assume everything's going to be great, that everybody's just going to be reasonable. How's that working out for us?
Well, we look at the Hebrew people. The Hebrew people wanted a king just like everybody else around them. God said, "You don't want a king. He's going to take all of your stuff." I mean, we've talked about this before, but dang, I mean, that's exactly what happens. Ultimate power corrupts absolute power.
And then you wash all this through Darwin, who. The origin of a species where, you got out of the box. Now you have the animal sense of who humans are, people taking that Darwin further, and human evolution, that we have now just simply we're animals who are need to satisfy desires.
Right.
And then Freud comes in and says, well, let's apply that to sexuality. We now are. It constitutes our full identity as opposed to just being part of what it means to be human.
Right.
So we're going to have these base desires. We might as well just give in to them. I mean, Freud believed marriage was a terrible thing.
Nonsense,
because it restricted that sense of desire. And so all of this runs very counter to a biblical worldview. And I'm characterizing some of these things.
Well, I understand. I mean, at this
there's
point,
a whole lot more to it than
there
this.
really is, and it's extraordinary when you think about the amount of time and effort and years of research and intellectual power that has been used to try to justify these.
Well, and it's permeated. It permeates the academy, and therefore it begins to trickle down, and we see the effects of it over time in culture, in Western culture.
Breakdown of family units, breakdown of marriage.
Individualism, the idea that pleasure is the primary focus of our happiness, that we have to, that when the framers of the Declaration said the pursuit of happiness, everybody said, well, that means obviously this kind of happiness, where that's not exactly what they meant.
Whatever I want.
They're actually more in a classical sense, looking back at philosophers like Aristotle and Seneca and Cicero and people like that, saying the real pursuit of happiness was virtue, but now that's been transformed into
whatever makes me feel good.
Whatever makes me feel good is the pursuit of my happiness, and that's essentially what's happening here in Pergamum, where you've got elements of the church saying, "Look, we know that we don't believe in these gods as Christians, but we could compromise a little bit here." Why get so wrapped up around the axle? We can fudge on this a bit, but what happens is you take an inch, you take a mile, and you begin to see how that begins to break the church apart, and we're seeing it in our own time.
Absolutely.
Are we going to give in to the idea that sexuality, for example, which is the big issue, is that a primary focus of what it means to be a human being, or is it a part of what it means to be a human being? Does God have something to say about that from the beginning? Are we starting from that point, or are we starting from human experience and saying, well, we feel this way, so therefore we're going to act this way? Those are two very different things, and they're not really compatible worldviews.
Not really. I mean, the issue that I see, let's say I start really questioning who I am and what I am. Now all of a sudden, the destination becomes unclear because I can't even find my starting point.
Right.
It makes a total difference because I can't move in the structure of the way in which God has made me because I'm busy worrying about this origin story when it's actually right here in Scripture. The origin story is very clear.
Yeah.
It's not a hard target. It's not a moving target. It's a hard set point.
Yeah. We're designed in the image of God.
Absolutely.
And until we find that and live into that image, we're always going to be hunting. That sense of identity is crafted in so many ways. I mean, I remember growing up that people's identity was kind of crafted around their profession or things like that. We were always looking for alternatives to being people who have their identity in the image of God. And I think that's what Jesus is saying here to the churches. Look, this is really what I'm cutting and dividing here is you can't have it both ways.
Yeah.
You've got to choose which of these paths you're going to take. The problem we have is this is the cultural air that we breathe. This is like fish being in water, and we don't even recognize it's around us everywhere we look. And so to promote a Christian worldview, people say, well, that's very restrictive, that's very regressive, that's very this, that, or the other.
Right.
Whereas God says, this is really the way you were designed to live, and you're seeking all these other ways. And then we wonder why we struggle in our culture. The sexual revolution has blown up a lot of things. And I'm not just talking about the presenting issues that we think about, all the LGBTQ stuff, that's this much of a much bigger issue, which is we don't know who we are anymore as people, not only individually, but also collectively, because we've lost the plot. We've lost what it means to be people made in the image of God.
The arc of the whole scripture is a journey of reconciliation, being more at peace with God and with one another. But if our internal system, if our own internal framework, if we're fighting against that, we can't even find peace in ourselves, let alone peace with God and with one another.
Yeah. I mean, the mantra of our culture is be true to yourself.
Well, most people don't even know what that is.
Well, and what if yourself is an idiot?
It's true.
I mean, that's the teaching of original sin, right? We're not.
Yeah.
What are we being true to? Our sinful nature? Okay. Is that really where we want to go? Those are things that we have to really consider when we're reading the text. Again, Jesus is calling us back to this vision that goes all the way back to Genesis about who we are as individuals, who we are collectively as human beings, people made in the image of God, designed to reflect God's glory, designed to walk in the way God has for us. But we fight against it. We've been doing it since Genesis 3. What was the great temptation in the garden? We're going to be gods ourselves. We'll be like God. We can know good and evil. We can choose it for ourselves. But the problem is we always choose poorly.
Yeah.
Unless we are driven by the Spirit, unless we're in the way that God is calling us to. And I think God is always calling us to that way. And we're always going to be wandering until we find that way in Him. And that goes to do with what we do with our bodies, what we do with sexuality, what we do with consumption, all those kinds of things are all wrapped up in this. And we're going to get into this some next week. We're going to talk more about Gnosticism, which is kind of the next iteration of the philosophy that's going on here in Revelation. The idea that you can be spiritual and that's really desirable, but the material world, the body, things like, doesn't matter what we do with that. It's just the body. It's just this. What really matters is spiritual enlightenment, or gnosis, secret knowledge, was where that comes from. And if I separate those two things, then I could do whatever I want with my body as long as I'm spiritually. And you hear this in our culture.
Yeah.
People say to me, when they learn you're a pastor, and you probably experience this too.
Yeah.
People learn you're a pastor at a party. It's like, people step back, like, okay. And they'll say things like, I'm spiritual, but I'm not religious.
Yes, I've heard that a lot. Oh, my church is the outdoors.
What does that mean?
Yeah.
It means that I want to feel like I'm spiritual, but I don't want to do anything
about it
that actually connects with that.
Right.
My soul and my body are disconnected.
I had a wonderful conversation this week with a man, and he's, wonderful walking with the Lord, but he had talked to a pastor about his drug addiction, and the pastor told him, it doesn't necessarily matter what you do, there, as long as you're showing up to church on Sunday morning.
Wow.
Yeah, it's very, very scary that he had, and he, within his heart, we talk a lot about the military stuff, and I thought about the sword of the Spirit.
Yeah.
And this man had trouble with that, and actually came back to the pastor and said, I don't agree with this. I'm struggling with this.
Yeah.
I don't feel good about this.
It's all connected.
It is.
And when we disconnect things, that's when things start to go sideways. And we've gone a little bit far afield here, but that's the teaching of Balaam. That's why Jesus brings up this story.
I was just going to go there.
I figured that.
Yeah.
The idea of Balaam is, look, torture's not going to work. Cursing's not going to work. What other ways does Satan have to get at us? Well, to draw on those baser instincts.
Right.
Food is something we need. Sex is something we need for procreation. So let's let's make those ultimate things. And that's what King Balak of Moab finally does. He says, let's bring in the food. Let's invite them to a party. Let's not go to war with them. Let's invite them to a party, and they will get sucked into our culture and our ways.
And sure enough, it worked.
And that's what happens.
Yeah.
And that's the danger for the church in culture throughout history, to be in the world but not from the world, to be able to recognize that there's a higher kingdom, a higher value, that we have a different purpose for our lives than what philosophy will tell us, that our baser instincts are telling us. Mm-hmm. It's very popular in our culture for people to say, well, we're just born this way, we're just going to be this way. But that's why Jesus says in John 3, you must be born again, born of the Spirit.
Absolutely.
So that you become the person God created you to be.
Yeah. So, I mean, you mentioned both in the sermon and now, this is the water that we swim in. This is the air that we breathe. We don't even recognize that these are the mentalities that are around us. I just wonder, how can we identify it when those types of ideas seep into our church or our fellowship, and how can we have more discernment to avoid those types of traps?
Well, I think the first thing we have to do is talk about what a Christian worldview is. We're going to do a whole series on that in the fall.
Yeah.
Through kind of a Wesleyan lens, to think about what it means to be, because that's really ultimately what Christian doctrine is. It's the lens through which we look at. So what do we mean when we talk about God? What do we mean when we talk about human beings? We've gone over some of this before. We did a series on the Creed last fall.
Yeah.
But I think it requires a little bit more drilling down for us to really begin to form a Christian worldview.
Well, and the fact is, we sleep. So the things that we bring up in messages and things in the past, a lot of these things we always need to refresh.
Yeah.
So it's really, really special.
So I think really understanding from beginning to end what the Christian worldview really is about what it means to be a human being is really critical. That we're not simply products of our environment. We're not simply products of our desires. We're designed for something greater. We're designed to reflect God's glory. Those are the kind of things that we have to do. And one of the things, and I'm biased, but I think the Wesleyan vision of that is so powerful because it's always about being shaped into being more the image of God as reflected in Jesus Christ.
Absolutely.
Ultimately, that's one of the Wesleyan distinctives, is that we can be shaped into that image through the power of the Holy Spirit. What Wesley called sanctification, Christian perfection. We can be perfected in love, that our intentions can be changed.
Yeah.
We can really be transformed from the inside out.
Well, and
there's a lot of Christian theology that thinks, you're just totally depraved. You got to be saved so you can go to heaven when you die. What happens now? You're not going to be able to get there. But Wesley was very optimistic that the gospel actually works and that the Spirit can actually change us.
Absolutely.
And shift us into this worldview. But we have to have the base from which to work, and that base is knowledge of the Scriptures and what God created us to be.
Absolutely. And you talked about Balaam and the moving towards our baser instincts, but the whole purpose of the church is fellowship and communion so that we might actually draw nearer. Those psychologists miss out on the entire opportunity that we have as people of God to come together for the purpose of glorifying God.
Yeah, and I'm not down on psychology. I mean, I think there's a lot of important things that we learn about the human brain, and God created that too, and we need people to help us sort that out. But when we start looking at philosophy that permeates culture, we have to be critics. And what I mean by critic is not so much wagging our fingers, but to look critically at the things that are being taught to us or the things that are being shown to us on a daily basis.
Absolutely.
We live in a culture, for example, where the 40-year-old virgin is a comedy movie.
Yeah.
Like, how ridiculous might that be? Well, think about the fact that, as far as we know, Apostle Paul or Jesus, neither one ever married.
Right.
Would we say their life was not fulfilled?
Right.
Would we say that they do not live a full life? No, we wouldn't say that at all.
Absolutely.
So, what are we saying here? We're saying, again, ultimately our good is this. We've got to have all these things in our lives, whereas Jesus is saying there's something much greater
Absolutely.
that we need to pursue.
Oh, it's rich.
So there are a lot of things that are part of this. And obviously, the Balaam story, I love the Balaam story because of the donkey
Yes,
talking and the
it
argument
is.
with the donkey and all
It's
of that.
fantastic, yeah.
It's important. But I think at the end, what Jesus is saying, look, if you endure this, and I love the image of the white stone.
Me too.
Here's the ticket. Here's your ticket.
Yeah.
You've got your ticket to a greater way of being. You've got your ticket to life. How does he put it? He puts it at the very end. Whoever has ears, let them hear what the Spirit says to the churches. To the one who is victorious, I will give some of the hidden manna. I'll also give that person a white stone with a new name written on it,
Love
known
that.
only to the one who receives it. So that new name, you will have. And I think in some ways, you can interpret that in a lot of ways. One of the ways I like to interpret it is to think the new name that we receive is we belong to Christ.
Right.
And that's the ticket we receive into his kingdom, into his way of being in his life.
It's a wonderful promise. It's a beautiful promise at the end of a warning.
Yeah. And next week we're going to get into Thyatira, and that's the longest of the postcards and the most harsh in some ways. Jesus really gets at them. But interestingly, it's about the same stuff.
Yeah.
But from a different angle. And we're going to explore that when we get together.
Fantastic. We would welcome your questions and comments. Please like and subscribe to our podcast, to our Aldersgate York YouTube page. You can also email our questions if you have something that you really, want to parse through, on your own. Communications@aldersgateyork.com. It's a great place to email there.
We're glad you joined us, and we hope you'll join us again here on the Aldersgate Experience. We'll see you next week.
God bless.